Hi, Greg.
Hey, Noel. How are you doing?
Good. Let me get you screen share co-host.
It looks like I have it.
Okay. We're ready whenever you're ready.
Cool. Well, it'll take me a moment to pull up the PowerPoint that I have put together, but that is not how I want to start. I just want to start with a brief introduction. So thank you all for having me, and welcome for those of you who are joining. And my name is Greg Hildebrand. I have a bee business called Honey Bee Friendly, and that's HoneyBeefriendly. And you can find us at honeybeefriendly.com. You can follow sort of the adventure and see some of the honey that we produce on, social media at Honeybee Friendly on Facebook and Instagram. My main objective today is to be a resource to those of you looking to get into beekeeping. So with that being said, please take full advantage of the chat to me. I'll leave a quick hello for those of you who aren't used to using this. Feel free to reach out throughout this. I don't know if I'll take up a full 45 minutes with my PowerPoint, but again, those are going to just be some talking points. So a little bit about me, briefly, if I may. Like many beekeepers or people that have honeybees, I kind of found my way into that world just by chasing the natural curiosity I had, and I became completely hooked. So that's not an uncommon thing to hear people say. Uniquely, I guess, for some, being now that I have a bee business that supports my family and I get to say I'm a bee farmer, it's kind of unique not coming from an agricultural background, really not having honeybees or farming in general in my upbringing. I as I was coming into as an young adult, like I definitely had an appreciation for wild spaces and being out in nature and seeing, meadows of goldenrod in the fall and milkweeds in the summer. And I really did have a sort of appreciation for general what I might have had an idea were pollinators and that ecosystem. And I definitely, in my previous life and career where I traveled quite a bit and saw different parts of North America, I definitely developed a bit of a distaste for the unharmonious urbanization. Sometimes I found myself in really large cities and said, wow, they've really made an effort here to keep, a green space and wilderness and harmonious connection. But then all too often, and you'd find yourself in what's basically a desert of pavement and very little effort given back to the natural world and that ecosystem. So that was always in my blood, and that sort of has persisted into Honeybee Friendly. So I followed that curiosity. I had, in about 2010, read almost everything I could get my hands on about bees. which was pretty good for somebody who wasn't a very, you know, an avid reader prior to this topic. That I found I could actually really sink my teeth into it. And that spurred it on, to about 2012. I decided I'm going to buy some bees. I might as well. I mean, I've read so much about this and I'm so curious. So I bought a nucleus colony and a package of honeybees in 2012. By 2014, I decided, I'm in the right spot in my life. And this is something that I've really, at that point, I made that connection with the bees, working them, and what that did to me and what that changed me. So I started Honeybee Friendly in 2014 and built up to around 50 hives over the next 3 years. And in 2017, I was the first year that I decided to go migratory, which is where you move your bees around, pretty much like it sounds. I mean, perhaps you're doing so for chasing the season, chasing the bloom, or you're doing it just to move them around because you want to change the yards that you're keeping bees at. You have to move them a decent distance, but migratory really implies that you're moving a decent number of hives around for some sustainable commercial endeavor. So fast forward 5 years, we've been running bees migratorily, and what I have come to call full immersion beekeeping. That began when basically I would take my bees to South Carolina, and it's a 10-hour trip one way, and you kind of camp out with the bees. I mean, I didn't really have the budget to get a hotel room or put myself up like that. So I would drive there and work bees all day and set up a tent and a grill next to the bees in the same field and stay overnight. And, it forced me to, as that over the past 5 years, as that grew and I grew my numbers of hives, it really forced me into this full immersion where, there's really no other distractions when you're 10 hours away from your family and home. And the only objective of being there is to work these bees and achieve your goals. So that taught me a lot through firsthand experience with the migratory. And every year, that would translate. So I would take my bees south in the winter, over the course of the winter, and their spring, which starts oftentimes in the middle of January. You have your first tree blooms like maple and elm. And from there, it just builds. And by the time their spring has pretty much climaxed, our spring is getting going in Pennsylvania. So, each year it was just this learning that would transition through the rest of the year. Yes, I would take, in the past, I have some questions. I did take all of my hives. We've gotten to the point where I don't do that because I don't need to, and I do want to maintain some degree of Pennsylvania stock, if you will. But how long do you stay in one location? So that can be variable. If I was doing it more for a pollination contract, as a migratory beekeeper, you're essentially hired to pollinate that crop, and therefore you really only stay for a few weeks while it's in bloom. And then oftentimes you want to get your bees out of there as soon as, in a lot of those large monocultures, non-organic settings, the farmer says, all right, well, it's time to spray petal fall because, the bloom is done, and the beekeeper wants to get their bees out of there and not really linger while that event takes place. For me, it's more of a seasonal. So I'm chasing specific blooms. I'll get to it here. We have 3 yards in South Carolina. 2 of them are swamplands. One of them's more what's called the Sandy Hills, or like somewhat western South Carolina before you get to the little bit of Appalachia that they have. And in the swamplands, we're really those apiaries are set up for honey production. So I'm staying in that location until middle or end of May, when Tupelo is done blooming and hopefully making it back to Pennsylvania before our locust bloom with those honey production hives, because that's a big for our region here in the South Mountain. One of our big springtime apex bloomers with the potential of honey production is black locust. So that's what I'm trying to make it back. And then we have established a relationship with a property owner in Southern Virginia to produce sourwood honey, which is an Appalachian native, heartland native. I mean, it really is native to our area, the tree that is, but it grows a little bit better slightly south longitudinally or latitudinally and in a high altitude setting. So that blooms roughly 6 weeks because of the altitude. You see the bloom in the hollow in the valley and it continues up to the peak of the mountains. So it varies how long we leave them there. I haven't shared my screen yet. I'm just talking. I will get my PowerPoint pulled up here and we can jump into that. Yeah, and then finally after South Carolina, we move our bees back to Pennsylvania, where I do have some relationships with farmers for smaller scale pollination and just honey production. And then that's, of course, my home. So we are going to start this presentation, which is focused at homesteading. And I am going to hone in on keeping bees in your backyard and tell you guys how you can start that, tell you a little bit more about what you should be aware of for bees in general. So let me pull up my PowerPoint. Now, please keep in mind that I'm a beekeeper and my PowerPoint is more of a talking point. So keep those questions rolling and don't judge too harshly on the lack of information on the PowerPoint. So here we go. Will it leave the chat icon up for me? Noelle, are you able to see this?
Yep, it looks good.
Awesome. All right, I want to see where is my chat? So people, here we go. Cool. So I have my chat up. Feel free to ask any questions. I just put some pictures on here from my camera rolls and then pulled up a few things on other slides. So on the right side are a few hives set up in Adams County, Pennsylvania. And you can see some bees flying. This is how I set my hives up. All right, so backyard beekeeper. Here's how you get started. So bees, let's talk about pollinators at large. Obviously, this is how they tie into the whole system. Plants need pollination. It either happens through the wind or animals. Of course, a lot of you know this. I'm just kind of going over the background and the basics so that it'll all make sense as I build up here. You have birds, bats, moths, ants, bees, butterflies, people, all of which can contribute to pollinating plants that need another medium. Now, what makes bees unique out of that, you might ask? Well, bees uniquely, to be a bee, you only eat pollen and nectar. So, in the instance, say, a butterfly, like the caterpillar actually eats the leaves of the plant. So that's why it's a different species. But this is a unique trait. Think of bees, they're not really herbivores because they don't actually eat plants. They're eating the angiosperm, the pollen, and the carbohydrate of the nectar. So I find that interesting. And then sociality is one big thing that separates bees. So, there's no actual native honeybees to the North America, we do have fossil records of a New World honeybee that died, a couple million years ago. But the honeybee is actually the honeybee that is kept and is pictured here. This was a cool shot on the far right of the bottom of a honeybee colony, with some free-built comb. And, it really demonstrates the unique thing that honeybees have, which is this intense sociality. So I like to make that distinction. I look at each one of my hives as a single organism, not forcibly look at it that way, but I've come to really only understand and respect each colony as the organism. Of course, it's made up of tens of thousands of honeybees with one queen and a varying degree of, female to male ratio over the course of the year. But you really have to come to understand that if one bee in that colony is sick, that's not the point. Is your colony healthy? Is the colony diseased? Is it overridden with pests? Oftentimes Paris or pesticide exposure, it wipes out the entire colony. So that's the big distinction for honeybees. They are eusocial, so much social that they are exemplifying true altruism and coexisting as a family unit. All right. So, yeah, beekeeping, I often call it now a human construct. So the point I'm trying to make is bees are bees. And, whether they're managed or wild is kind of the difference here. Us humans have been interacting with honeybees for quite some time. Fossil or cave paintings dating Suevos de Años, like 5,000 years ago in Spain. Or I'm sorry, 8,000 years ago. And there's records, of Egyptians working the European honeybees up to 5,000 years. This is a picture of my friend Donnie, and we were catching a swarm down in South Carolina. He's holding a branch with a rather large honeybee swarm. So it's a human construct. It's highly unnatural to put bees in boxes on the ground, but this is how we manage them. And why do we do that? So if you're thinking about backyard beekeeping, ask yourself really what are your objectives? First, perhaps, you are trying to pollinate some crops. How many crops do you have? Do you have acres of, fruit, or do you have a smaller biodiverse backyard? Because of course there are other bees that I want to talk about beekeeping. Perhaps you want to make honey. Well, then you're going to need honeybees. Perhaps you want to start a bee business and raise some queens or nucleus colonies, or be able to sell bees as a facet of your homestead, as a facet of your income. And that is totally possible. And I'm here to tell you how. So, what do you need to be aware of? Number C there. Yeah, that would be letter C. Apologize. What do you need to be aware of if you're going to get into honeybees? A, honeybees are livestock. This means that you will also experience dead stock. It's a little, not to be morbid, but it is a reality. Oftentimes I see people get into keeping honeybees and very quickly get out of it because of the defeat of losing your bees. Some of you listening to me might have already experienced this, perhaps. So this is a very much reality of beekeeping and something to be, prepared of. Now, of course, the goal is to mitigate that death, but also just in the perpetuation of a living colony, you have a very high turnover of individual bees. In the active season of honey production, the bee's life, each individual worker bee is roughly 6 weeks. So, what else to be aware of? There are native bees that you can manage too. Now, as I mentioned, you're not going to get honey. So if that's your sole desire or objective, of course you need honeybees. But I really think it's fair for a homesteader's perspective, a backyard gardener, somebody who wants to, just give back to the environment. It's really fair to give the native bees some equal attention here. Um, and you can manage them. And in fact, if you have a smaller backyard garden, an acre or less, if you really want pollination of your smaller vegetables, honeybees are not the choice. And I'm sorry if I'm bursting any bubbles there, but honeybees are going to source their food on average up to 3 miles in any direction. And the scout bees are going to leave that hive and find the absolute best thing in bloom and communicate all the other field bees to go, forage in this direction and find this thing. And that's what they're going to do. And it's almost a guarantee that a lot of the year, the majority of your honeybees in your backyard are going to be finding their food far elsewhere. Whereas some of the native bees that I'll mention, and I think it's fair to mention, are very good pollinators on a small scale. There's far less of them, but they do not travel up to 3 miles in any direction to find food. They will travel maybe 100 yards, and cover basically an acre. So it's definitely worth considering. I do manage both, not commercially, but just out of that love and curiosity. I've been keeping native bees, and that's something you can ask me more about, and I can point you in the direction of the right resources if you are curious. Lastly, what else you need to be aware of? If you get into honeybees, do not be a bee haver, if you will. It's like, that is really not a conceited judgment. It's a plea to you that these livestock need serious management, and you can choose a lot of different ways. And we'll get into the problems affecting bees next, but you really need to be attentive. They are livestock. You wouldn't buy a handful of chickens and just say, all right, go find water and go, find food in the yard. No, you're probably going to have to, feed those chickens and give them fresh water to keep them alive. And honeybees are no different. I mean, they're not wild bees. After millennia of managing them, we've really created, these beautiful creatures that you can hold in your bare hand, but they're also livestock. So don't be a bee haver. I think I beat that one enough. So next slide, problems. Now, this is hilarious. I don't know. No, bees do not get coronavirus, but I put this image down here for a very specific reason, and it's because of disease and pests. Now, I'll get to that one last, but the big one is habitat loss. So what's happening to bees? What are the problems affecting them? What are the problems affecting pollinators at large? And not just honeybees, but the native bees too. Habitat loss is a big one for all the above. Consider this: a honeybee colony will produce 1 pound of honey from roughly 2 million blossoms. So that's 2 million blossoms equals 1 pound of honey. Your honeybee hive or colony needs, if you want to take honey from it and you want it to survive without having to totally supplementally feed it, it's going to have to produce roughly 200 pounds of honey. So 200 pounds of honey at 200 or 2 million blossoms is about 400 million blossoms, 400 million flowers for one beehive. How does that translate? Try and wrap your head around that. We're talking about, obviously there's a succession of bloom. I talked about the black locust kind of being one of the big apex blooming honey producing plants in our home in the South Mountain region of Pennsylvania. But that blooms for a week. Usually, if you're lucky, and that's one of the beekeepers, plights, is it's really hard to you got to be at the right point. But what happens after that tree blooms? Well, of course, there's a lot of different plants, but this habitat loss and what a lot of urbanized parts of the world have kind of not looked at is and this is something that's being talked about in this, Jesse talked about it in the beginning, our keynote, like this permaculture idea, if everybody planted more flowers, my gosh, what an impact it would have. And I urge you to at least do that, even if it's not edible flowers or food. Put in more flowers and less lawn, that, to the degree that it fits your lifestyle and your family, please. Because birds and all pollinators, insects, they all need the seeds, they all need the nectar and the pollen. And that's one of the biggest things affecting bees at large, is they are just starving. They are having, when it comes to the fall time, which typically when you get to fall, all of your trees are done blooming. And we're talking about meadows, and meadows don't exist in a lot of landscape. And so the bees are really forced to essentially live off of table scraps. So that's a big one. Toxicity, of course, I don't think I need to preach that too hard in this group of, I think we're all a little bit more like-minded here, that, organic's more the way to go, and not just spraying herbicides and pesticides. They have their places. I will recognize that. But, toxicity exists on a residential level and on a commercial level. And when you're talking about honeybees specifically that travel up to 3 miles in any direction to find their food, you can pick 3-mile radius, a 6-mile diameter, almost anywhere in America, and you're probably going to encounter residential and agricultural spaces. And so the toxicity for all bees and pollinators, exists on both of those fronts. And if you're not a commercial farmer, or you don't own a commercial business with lawn and habitat, and you're just a residential person, that might be all you have an influence over. So finally, the reason I put the coronavirus, disease and pests. Honeybees specifically have one major pest. It made it to America around the time that I was born. So I never knew beekeeping before our nemesis, the varroa mite. So if you're going to get into honeybees, you need to know about the varroa mite. It's a native parasite to one of the Asian honeybee species, and it has made its way worldwide. I believe New Zealand has it now. I know that Newfoundland does not have varroa mite, and Australia also used to be without varroa mite, but I think Newfoundland's about the only place it hasn't made it to as of 2021. It is a parasite, or a parasitoid in the case of the European honeybee, because it pretty much will affect your hive, your colony, to the brink of it dying and completely collapsing. This parasitoid, it does not suck the bee's blood, but it is essentially feeding off of the bee's fat bodies. And it's much like a tick in that this is the point of the pandemic. It infects the bee with specific viruses. The varroa mite virus, deformed wing virus is a big one. So let me tell you about deformed wing virus briefly. And this is why I chose this picture. We have found that deformed wing virus has spread in a pandemic scale to native bees who do not have the varroa mite on them and cannot be a host insect for this varroa mite. So this varroa mite you see is very specifically evolved to only work with honeybee colonies. It needs the brood to reproduce, and it needs the same biological time frame of that to be able to reproduce. So it does not exist on any other bees. It's completely specific to honeybees, and yet because of the viruses, it spreads and how we've watched them mutate and multiply over the past 30 years since it's been in North America. We've actually seen more viruses and a mutation of them, and we've started to find them crossing over into native bee populations because, well, unfortunately, the honeybees visit flowers and a diseased honeybee leaves viral particles on the flower, and it quite literally gets picked up and has mutated to bumblebees and other native bees. So it's not all gloom and doom, folks. There's actually some really great research using mycelium that, boost all bees, immune system and really fight this. But so a question that just came up is colony collapse parasite driven or chemical driven? So colony collapse disorder is something that was coined, and used in the expression of the loss of honeybees through the media, when this became a big story and still is. Colony collapse disorder is driven by all three of these. It is a condition where the colony of a honeybee colony suddenly collapses, and it is totally a culmination of multiple stress factors on the hive. It is not actually like one specific disease like coronavirus. It's colony collapse disorder is a culmination of all of these stressors taking part on the honeybees. And that varroa mite is a big one. I can't stress it enough. If you get into honeybees, you need to educate yourself on how to test for varroa mites, how to handle them, and have an integrated pest management. So let me move on real quick, and I'm going to touch on these guys briefly. Again, if you have a backyard and a small scale farmer or grower, there really are other options for you. Of course, if you want to produce honey, honeybees are the only ones. Mason bees are native. This is a type of mason bee, blue orchard mason bee, builds its, as the name suggests, their cocoons out of mud, and you can manage them in tubes like so. The next one, leafcutter bees, build their cocoons. I love these guys. I think they're adorable, but megalache, the Latin, is because of a very large mouth appendage where they're able to cut. As you can see, it's carrying leaves back to these tubes, and you can also provide them with nesting habitat. That's almost all you have to do. You can order the cocoons of the last two bees, but depending on where you live, you likely have some of these in your backyard, and it's as easy as providing them nesting habitat. And you're going to see these guys cutting leaves and flying them around your backyard and building their cocoons, and they're going to pollinate all of your vegetables and fruit and smaller scale stuff, honestly, much better than a honeybee colony will, just because of the locality and the scale. And then finally, we also, bumblebees. What a great friend of ours. I think this is my earliest childhood fascination and memory of bees. Bumblebees are absolutely intelligent and very fascinating little guys, or girls, I should say. They can be purchased for commercial pollination of plants that are very specific to buzz pollination, such as blueberries and tomatoes. I know some farmer friends, that have purchased bumblebees. I would love to expand my business and get into more of these native guys as a pollination for small scale farmers and be able to help other people set up habitat of these past three bees in their own yards, because I think they deserve equal attention. And I think that if you love bees, you should have one of each, a honeybee colony, and some other native bee nesting sites. Because let's face it, these native bees also are far less expensive to get into. All right, let's talk about honeybees, which may be the main thing that y'all want to hear from me. So I have a question real quick. So native bees for pollination, non-native honeybees for pollination, plus you get honey. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're a real bee geek or a beak like I am, why not diversify? Just like you would, have biodiversity in your garden, get a few different bee, habitats going. So honeybees, these are the main 4 discussion points I want to talk about. This picture on the right is one of our nucleus production yards in South Carolina. I believe this picture was taken last year. So tools and protective wear. I urge you to purchase a veil. You don't have to go all out and get gloves and a suit and everything if you don't wish, but I do not recommend starting out with honeybees thinking you're not going to get stung. And the main thing that honeybees will look at are they see polarized light, which means they see moisture, which means they're going to see your eyes, nose, and mouth. And they also see contrasting colors and motion. So if you're someone like me, perhaps with light skin color and dark hair and very dark eyebrows and a beard, and you're in a bee yard or around honeybees talking and moving and blinking, they're going to see your face. And they also have they detect carbon dioxide. So they really are, the veil is kind of the main protective wear. From there, there's plenty of, depending on how much money you want to spend, like you can get full suits, you can get jackets, you can get long gloves. And to be honest, I have one of each. I found in my practice of working bees, especially in the blooms, in the heavy season, I'm out in the woods and working bees like 8 hours or more a day. Of course, that varies in the winter, but in the hot time of the year, I like being able to go to work in a bathing suit. And so I have a full ventilated head to toe bee suit that I prefer for the summer because it's actually cooler if I, wear a like swim trunks or shorts underneath it. It's actually more comfortable than wearing jeans and a button up and just the head veil, which I do prefer for a lot of the year. So wear a mask, comment. As in, the veil is a full head covering. But yeah, if you're keeping bees with other people, you might have to wear a mask. So tools, there are 2 tools, and you can see the one right here. I also think these are 2 necessities. This is called a smoker. You can see the smoke coming out of it. The bee smoker serves a couple purposes. So the smoke, and it doesn't matter necessarily what you're burning, it masks the alarm pheromone. So before you open up one of these colonies, or hives, I should say, before you open up a hive to inspect the colony within, you blow some of this smoke or bellow it into the entrance, and then you take off the lid and bellow a little bit into the upper part of the colony. And that immediately masks or, covers up the pheromone that is used by the guard bees as an alarm. So it keeps this colony a little more relaxed and doesn't set off the alarm. So the next thing that smoke does is actually, the bees do isolate that smell of burning to fire. And when you'll find that when you smoke the colony, it masks that alarm pheromone. And one of the first things that happens is all the nurse bees, the bees whose job is to, well, I should just say all the housekeeping bees who manage the interior of the nest, they start gorging themselves with honey. They actually start filling their special honey stomachs up in this instinctual response to fire in case their tree, if you will, is burning down. And at the last possible moment, they will leave their nest. And in that instinctual response, they're carrying as much food resource with them. And in turn, this gorging themselves with honey makes them very lethargic and very calm and easy to work. So those are the two primary things that smoke does for you. Lastly, when you're pulling these boxes apart, oh, 5-minute warning. No way. That was fast. So when you're putting the boxes back together, the smoke helps you kind of herd the bees, move them in a direction. Hive equipment is variable. I'll get through these real quick. You can choose 5-frame nucleus hives. You can choose 8-frame. The industry standard tends to be a 10-frame hive. And that's what I would select if I had, that as a recommendation. You can get medium-sized boxes like this one pictured, and you can get deep boxes. It depends on, perhaps your age and physical, like how much weight you can lift comfortably. The mediums do provide an ease for lifting that the deeps don't really. Setting up an apiary in your backyard, there's definitely some considerations. So the main things about location that are bad for the bees would be a hollow or an area where cool, damp air will settle. And then over the course of the winter, if you're not going to move your bees like I do, think about what the sun exposure is. You do want them to have some shade, but over the winter when the leaves are falling down, you want them to be getting southern sunlight to help solar warm the hives up and keep those bees, a little bit warmer in the winter. And then one of the really good things to do, especially for a winter apiary, is to make sure that they have a north and northwesterly facing wind block, something that's going to cut down those straight line winds, something that's going to kind of insulate your apiary. And then, of course, setting up an apiary in a backyard, you might want to talk to neighbors if you live close. You don't want to put this colony right outside the hive, right outside where you live, every single day walking in and out of your house. You probably want to put it, I would say often, 20 feet to 30 feet is pretty safe. A visual barrier goes a long way for honeybees. So if you're in a backyard, and you can place them like a fence or rows of plants that aren't, well, plants go away in the winter, so your neighbors will see the hive, but something to also to separate, where you're coming in and out of your house and in your car from the entrance of the hive. So those bees aren't, the guard bees don't necessarily see you all the time. They might be able to be, your hive might be able to be closer to your house if you have sort of a visual barrier. And then their flight path also, the bees leave the entrance, and in an apiary like this, there's really nothing in front of the entrances of the hive, so they can fly rather low. If you live in a smaller backyard, if you have a smaller backyard that you want to put bees, some kind of something in front of the entrance, like a fence or a row of plants or a shed, will help direct the bees' flight up. And that can also be a good consideration for backyard beekeeping. How to get honeybees? There are two main ways. I didn't mean to click that, but package bees are 3 pounds roughly bees shaken into a box with a mated queen in a cage. And then nucleus colonies are 4, often 5 of the actual frames that are inside the hive, and they have all the comb and the worker bees and a queen living on it. So there are pros and cons to both. Feel free to ask, later in the question answer period. Or again, this is honeybee friendly. So honeybeefriendly.com. I have, comments and questions placed on there. Or if you do social media, find me on there. And I would be happy to fulfill the objective of being a resource for everybody on this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for the opportunity. Please don't hesitate to reach out for anything that I talked about that you need more clarification or questions that you may have. So
Excellent.
that's it.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Yep. Thank
And
you
as
all.
Greg said, head on over to the wrap-up panel and discussion. And if you have other questions, you can ask those at that time. Thanks.